the roar of engines, and the flash of Hollywood's brightest stars. For decades, Steve McQueen represented everything America wanted to be: tough, cool, untouchable. He was the king of cool, after all. But behind those piercing blue eyes and that unforgettable smile lay secrets that would shock even his most devoted fans. Today, at 85 years old, one of the women who knew him best is finally ready to tell the truth. The truth about the man behind the legend. The truth about what really happened behind closed doors. And the truth about a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but was crumbling from within. This is the story they didn't want you to hear. The one that's been buried for decades beneath layers of Hollywood glamour and carefully crafted publicity. But silence has its expiration date, and today that date has arrived. Steve McQueen wasn't born into privilege or comfort. He came into this world on March 24, 1930, in a charity ward in Beech Grove, Indiana. His mother, Julian Crawford, was just a teenager, barely equipped to handle the responsibilities of motherhood. His father, William McQueen, was a stunt pilot in a traveling circus who abandoned the family when Steve was just 6 months old. The absence of a father figure would haunt Steve for the rest of his life, shaping every relationship he would ever have, particularly with women. His mother was unpredictable, moving from man to man, city to city, never providing the stability a young boy desperately needed. She was often absent, leaving Steve with relatives or, worse, complete strangers. When he was 3 years old, his mother left him with her Uncle Claude in Slater, Missouri. Claude Thompson was a hog farmer, a hard man who lived a hard life. But paradoxically, those years on the farm would be some of the happiest of Steve's childhood. There, away from his mother's chaos, he learned about animals, machinery, and the value of hard work. But good things rarely lasted in Steve McQueen's early life. At age 8, his mother came back for him, dragging him to Indianapolis where she had moved in with a new boyfriend. This man was violent, an alcoholic who terrorized both Julian and young Steve. The boy watched his mother get beaten, felt the sting of abuse himself, and learned that love and pain were often intertwined. It was a lesson that would poison his relationships for decades to come. Unable to cope with the violence and his mother's neglect, Steve began acting out. He started skipping school, getting into fights, stealing. By the time he was 14, he'd been caught stealing hubcaps and was sent to the California Junior Boys Republic in Chino, a reform school for troubled youth. But something unexpected happened there. The school's approach was different. Instead of punishment, they offered structure, responsibility, and respect. For the first time in his life, Steve found a place where his actions had consistent consequences, where authority figures didn't abandon or abuse him. He thrived there, and years later, he would credit the Boys Republic with saving his life. He never forgot what they did for him, and even as he became one of the biggest movie stars in the world, he continued to support the institution financially and emotionally. After leaving the Boys Republic at 16, Steve bounced around working odd jobs. Selling pens, working as a towel boy in a brothel, even joining the Merchant Marines. In 1947, at just 17, he joined the United States Marine Corps. But his rebellious streak hadn't been completely tamed. He was demoted to private 7 times for various infractions, including going AWOL for 2 weeks to be with a girlfriend. Yet even in the Marines, there were glimmers of the man he would become. He saved the lives of 5 fellow Marines during an Arctic exercise when their tank broke through ice into the sea. It was an act of pure instinct and courage, the kind that would later make him perfect for the action roles that would define his career. After his discharge in 1950, Steve drifted to New York City. He was lost, directionless, sleeping on the streets or crashing with whoever would have him. He did whatever work he could find: longshoreman, bartender, mechanic. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. A girlfriend at the time suggested he try acting. Initially, Steve scoffed at the idea. Acting seemed like something for privileged, educated people, not for a kid from the wrong side of everywhere. But he needed money, and someone told him acting school provided a stipend. That was enough. He enrolled in the neighborhood Playhouse School of the Theater, studying under Sanford Meisner, one of the most respected acting teachers in America. Meisner saw something raw and real in Steve, something that couldn't be taught: authenticity. While other students were learning to project and perform, Steve just had to be. His tough guy exterior wasn't an act. His simmering intensity wasn't manufactured. It was who he was, forged in the fires of an impossibly difficult childhood. He started getting small parts in off-Broadway productions, then television appearances. He was hungry, driven in a way that came from having nothing and being determined never to go back to nothing again. In 1956, Steve landed a role in the Broadway production of A Hatful of Rain. It was there, in the world of theater and ambition, that he met a woman who would change his life forever. Her name was Neile Adams. Neile Adams was everything Steve wasn't. She was sophisticated, talented, already established in her career as a dancer and actress. Born Ruby Nilam Salvador Arrastia in the Philippines, she had escaped the Japanese occupation of Manila as a child, eventually making her way to New York, where she reinvented herself as Neile Adams. She was beautiful, vivacious, and on the rise. She had appeared in Broadway shows and was making her mark in Hollywood. When she first saw Steve McQueen, she wasn't immediately impressed. He was rough around the edges, intense in a way that was almost unsettling. But Steve was mesmerized. Here was a woman with class, talent, and stability, everything his mother hadn't been. He pursued her relentlessly. Steve could be incredibly charming when he wanted something, and he wanted Neile. Their courtship was whirlwind. Steve's intensity, which could be frightening in anger, was intoxicating in romance. He made Neile feel like she was the only woman in the world. He was vulnerable with her in ways he'd never been with anyone else, sharing the painful details of his childhood, his fears, his dreams. Neile saw the wounded boy beneath the tough exterior, and she wanted to heal him. It's a story as old as time. A woman who believes her love can save a broken man. They married on November 2nd, 1956, in a small ceremony. Neile's mother attended, but wasn't happy about the union. She had warned her daughter that successful men rarely stayed faithful, that Hollywood was a graveyard of broken marriages. But Neile was in love, and love, especially young love, doesn't listen to warnings. In the beginning, their marriage seemed to defy the odds. They were a team. Neile put her own burgeoning career on hold to support Steve's. She read his scripts, helped him prepare for roles, managed their household, and soon their children. Their daughter Terry was born in 1959, followed by their son Chad in 1960. Neile became the anchor Steve had never had, the stable presence that allowed him to take risks in his career. And those risks paid off spectacularly. Steve's breakout role came in 1958 with the television series Wanted, Dead or Alive. He played bounty hunter Josh Randall, a laconic, tough character that seemed tailor-made for Steve's persona. The show ran for 3 seasons and made Steve McQueen a household name. But television was just the beginning. In 1960, Steve made the leap to film with The Magnificent Seven, playing Vin Tanner alongside Yul Brynner. The film was a massive hit, and Steve's cool, understated performance stood out even in an ensemble cast. He followed it up with The Great Escape in 1963, where his motorcycle chase scene became iconic, cementing his image as the ultimate rebel. Then came The Cincinnati Kid in 1965, Nevada Smith in 1966, The Thomas Crown Affair in 1968, and Bullet in 1968, featuring what is still considered one of the greatest car chase scenes in cinema history. By the late 1960s, Steve McQueen wasn't just a movie star. He was the movie star, the highest-paid actor in Hollywood. He had everything: fame, fortune, a beautiful family, and a wife who had sacrificed her own dreams to support his. From the outside, they were the perfect Hollywood couple. But inside their home, behind the closed doors of their mansion, a very different story was unfolding. The problems had started early, though Neile tried to ignore them. Steve's childhood trauma hadn't been healed by success or love. If anything, his demons grew stronger as he became more powerful. He was pathologically jealous. If Neile spoke to another man at a party, even innocently, Steve would explode in rage. He would accuse her of infidelity, question her every move, interrogate her about her whereabouts. It was suffocating. But worse than the jealousy were Steve's own infidelities. Despite demanding absolute loyalty from Neile, Steve felt entitled to sleep with whoever he wanted. It started during the filming of his early movies. Co-stars, extras, fans, it didn't matter. Steve saw his fame as a free pass to indulge every desire. Neile knew. Of course she knew. Other wives would tell her, or she'd hear rumors, or sometimes Steve wouldn't even bother hiding it. He'd come home smelling of another woman's perfume, or he'd be spotted by someone leaving a hotel with an actress. Each betrayal cut deeper than the last. But Neile stayed. She stayed because she loved him, because they had children together, because divorce was stigmatized, because she believed in her wedding vows, and because some part of her still believed she could save him. Steve's affairs weren't just casual flings. Some were intense, passionate relationships that threatened to destroy his marriage entirely. During the filming of Love with the Proper Stranger in 1963, Steve had an affair with his co-star Natalie Wood. Natalie was one of Hollywood's most beautiful and talented actresses, married at the time to Robert Wagner. The affair was passionate and reckless. They weren't particularly careful about hiding it, and rumors spread quickly through Hollywood's tight-knit community. For Neile, this was different from the nameless women Steve slept with. Natalie Wood was someone she knew, someone in their social circle. It was humiliating, but Steve couldn't or wouldn't stop. The affair with Natalie eventually burned out, as these things often do, but it left scars on everyone involved. Neile became more withdrawn, more resigned to her fate as the wife of a serial cheater. She focused on their children, on maintaining some semblance of normalcy for Terry and Chad. Meanwhile, Steve's behavior was becoming more erratic. His success had given him power, and power unchecked can corrupt even those with good intentions. Steve, who had never had good intentions when it came to fidelity, became almost monstrous in his entitlement. He was also increasingly involved with drugs. In the 60s and early 70s, Hollywood was awash in drugs. Marijuana, cocaine, LSD, everything was available and everything was acceptable in certain circles. Steve dove in headfirst. The drugs amplified his worst tendencies. When he was high, his paranoia increased, his temper became even more volatile, his judgment even more impaired. There were nights when Neile wasn't sure if her husband would come home, and nights when she almost wished he wouldn't because of the chaos he brought with him. Friends and colleagues noticed the change in Steve, but in Hollywood, you didn't talk about such things. Everyone had secrets, everyone was indulging in something, and the code was silence. Besides, Steve's films were making millions of dollars. As long as he showed up on set and delivered performances that audiences loved, his private life was his own business. But for Neile, it wasn't a private life. It was her life, her daily reality, her ongoing nightmare dressed up as a fairy tale. The breaking point came in the early 1970s, though it had been building for years. Steve had started making plans to film The Getaway, a crime thriller based on a novel by Jim Thompson. He would be starring opposite Ali MacGraw, one of the most beautiful and successful actresses of the era. Ali had just come off the massive success of Love Story, which had made her a global superstar. She was married to Robert Evans, the legendary producer and then head of Paramount Pictures. They were Hollywood royalty, one of those couples everyone assumed would be together forever. They were wrong. From the moment Steve and Ali met on the set of The Getaway, in 1972, there was a palpable chemistry. Ali would later write in her memoir that she was obsessed with Steve from the moment he stepped into my world. The feeling was mutual. Steve pursued Ali with the same single-minded intensity he'd once directed at Neile. The affair wasn't subtle. Everyone on set knew what was happening. The crew, the director Sam Peckinpah, the other actors, they all watched as Steve and Ali fell into each other with an abandon that was both passionate and destructive. Neile knew too. By this point, she had developed a sixth sense for her husband's affairs, and this one was impossible to miss. Steve was different this time. He wasn't trying to hide it or apologize for it. He was flaunting it. He talked about Ali constantly, made excuses to call her, stayed late on set even when his scenes were done. It was clear to Neile that this wasn't just another affair. Steve was in love, truly in love, perhaps for the first time since the early days of their marriage. And that realization was devastating. Neile could have weathered another affair. She had weathered dozens already. But she couldn't compete with what Steve felt for Ali MacGraw. The affair blew up both marriages. Robert Evans was blindsided, destroyed by Ali's betrayal. He had given her everything, launched her career, made her a star, and she had thrown it all away for Steve McQueen. The tabloids went crazy. Headlines screamed about the scandal. Photos of Steve and Ali together appeared in every magazine. It was the talk of Hollywood, the nation, the world. 2 marriages destroyed, children's lives upended, all for passion. In 1972, after 15 years of marriage, Neile Adams and Steve McQueen divorced. It was one of the most painful experiences of Neile's life. Despite everything, she still loved him. She had built her entire adult life around him, had sacrificed her career, her dreams, her sense of self. And now it was over, ended not because she wanted it, but because Steve had found someone else. The divorce was finalized, and in July 1973, Steve married Ali MacGraw in a ceremony in Wyoming. It seemed like a victory for love, a triumph of passion over convention. Two beautiful people who couldn't resist each other had overcome all obstacles to be together. The press ate it up. Finally, Steve McQueen had found his match, they said. Ollie MacGraw was as strong-willed and independent as he was. She wouldn't put up with his nonsense the way Neile had. This marriage would be different. They were half right. It was different, but not in the way anyone expected. The problem started almost immediately. Steve's jealousy, which had tormented Neile, became even more intense with Ollie. Ollie had been a huge star before she met Steve, and she had her own career, her own identity. Steve couldn't handle it. He wanted Ollie to give up acting, to focus entirely on him. He was pathologically insecure about her past, about her relationship with Robert Evans, about any man who so much as looked at her. Ollie would later describe Steve's jealousy as constant, a suffocating presence that colored every moment of their marriage. He would go through her belongings looking for evidence of infidelity that didn't exist. He would interrogate her about her past, demand details about previous relationships, then fly into rages when she answered honestly. He controlled what she wore, where she went, who she saw. It was textbook abusive behavior, but Ollie, like Neile before her, initially believed she could handle it, that her love would be enough to soothe Steve's insecurities. She was wrong. Steve's controlling behavior escalated. He insisted Ollie give up her career entirely. At the peak of her fame, when she could have commanded any role in Hollywood, Ollie MacGraw walked away from acting to be Mrs. Steve McQueen. She later admitted this was one of the biggest mistakes of her life. Without her work, without her identity as an actress, Ollie became completely dependent on Steve. And Steve, perhaps unconsciously, wanted it that way. If Ollie had nowhere to go, no career to return to, no independent identity, she would never leave him the way he feared she would. But removing her autonomy didn't make Steve less insecure. It made him more controlling. They moved to a ranch in Santa Paula, California, away from Hollywood and the temptations Steve claimed were there. But isolation didn't solve their problems. It magnified them. With no friends nearby, no work to focus on, Ollie's entire world became Steve and his moods, his demons, his needs. And those needs were substantial. Steve was still using drugs heavily, still drinking too much, still carrying all the trauma of his childhood that he'd never properly addressed. The emotional abuse that Ollie endured was constant. Steve would belittle her, criticize her appearance, compare her unfavorably to his previous conquests. He would swing between intense affection and cold rejection, keeping Ollie in a constant state of uncertainty. This kind of behavior is typical of abusers. It keeps the victim off balance, always trying to please, always walking on eggshells, never knowing which version of their partner they'll encounter on any given day. Friends who saw them together were shocked at how much Ollie had changed. The confident, radiant star had become withdrawn, anxious, a shadow of herself. But Ollie tried to make it work. She had blown up her marriage to Robert Evans for Steve. She had given up her career for him. She had invested everything in this relationship, and admitting it was a mistake felt impossible. But the final straw wasn't Steve's emotional abuse or control. It was his infidelity. Yes, the same man who flew into jealous rages at the thought of Ollie, even speaking to another man, was cheating on her. Steve's hypocrisy knew no bounds. He began having affairs almost immediately after marrying Ollie, the same pattern he'd followed with Neile. It was as if the chase was more important to Steve than the relationship itself. Once he had a woman completely, once she had proven her devotion by sacrificing everything for him, he lost interest and needed to conquer someone new. Ollie found out about the affairs and was devastated. She confronted Steve, and he didn't even bother denying it. In his mind, his cheating was somehow different from what he imagined Ollie might do. He was a man, a star, entitled to his dalliances. She was his wife, his property, and she needed to stay faithful and keep her mouth shut. The double standard was so blatant, so insulting, that even Ollie, who had endured so much already, couldn't stomach it. Their fights became legendary, screaming matches that could be heard by neighbors even though they lived on a ranch with acreage between homes. The passion that had brought them together had curdled into something toxic and destructive. Both of them were miserable, but Steve refused to let Ollie leave. He would threaten her, promise to change, then revert to the same behavior days or weeks later. It was a cycle of abuse that Ollie would later recognize as classic, but in the moment, she felt trapped. In 1978, after 5 years of marriage, Ollie MacGraw finally found the strength to leave. The divorce was bitter, ugly, and very public. The same tabloids that had celebrated their passionate union now chronicled its spectacular implosion. Ollie left with almost nothing. She had given up her career during the prime earning years of her life. Her reputation had been damaged by the scandal of how their relationship began, and she was emotionally shattered from years of abuse. It would take her decades to recover, to understand what had happened to her, to forgive herself for staying as long as she did. Meanwhile, Steve moved on quickly, as he always did. He had already met his next wife, a woman named Barbara Minty. Barbara was 24 years old, a successful model from Oregon. She was beautiful, blonde, wholesome, everything Ollie wasn't. And importantly, she wasn't a major star. She didn't have the kind of career or identity that threatened Steve's ego. They met at a photo shoot in 1977. Barbara later recalled that she knew who Steve McQueen was, of course, but she wasn't particularly impressed by his fame. She was a small-town girl at heart, more interested in nature and photography than Hollywood glamour. This appealed to Steve. Barbara represented something pure, uncorrupted by the Hollywood machine that Steve simultaneously relied on and resented. They began dating while Steve was still married to Ollie, another overlap that would become a pattern in his relationships. He couldn't bear to be alone, always needing to have the next woman lined up before leaving the current one. Steve pursued Barbara with his typical intensity. He showed her the softer side of himself, the vulnerable man who just wanted peace and love. He talked about wanting to leave Hollywood behind, to live simply, to find meaning beyond fame and fortune. Barbara, young and somewhat naive about the ways of Hollywood, believed him. She saw the man she wanted to see, not necessarily the man he was. They married in January 1980 in a quiet ceremony. It was Steve's third marriage, and by all accounts, it started out happily. They lived on Steve's ranch in Santa Paula, raising horses and living what appeared to be an idyllic life away from the spotlight. But this happiness was shadowed by a terrible truth. Steve was dying. By the time he married Barbara, Steve already knew something was seriously wrong with his health. He had been diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer caused by asbestos exposure. The doctors traced it back to Steve's time in the military, where he had been exposed to asbestos in ship holds and protective suits. The prognosis was grim. There was no cure, and most patients died within a year of diagnosis. Steve tried to keep the news quiet, seeking treatment from both conventional doctors and alternative healers. He was desperate, willing to try anything to beat the disease. Barbara stood by him through all of it. This young woman, barely into her 20s, suddenly found herself as the primary caregiver for one of the world's biggest movie stars as he slowly wasted away. It was not the life she had signed up for. Steve's illness revealed both the best and worst of his character. On one hand, facing death seemed to soften him. He talked more openly about his regrets, about the people he'd hurt, about the life he'd lived. He expressed remorse for how he'd treated Neile and Ollie, though he never reached out to them to apologize. He also reconnected with his faith, something he'd abandoned during his Hollywood years. On the other hand, his fear and pain made him difficult. He could be demanding and short-tempered, taking his frustration out on Barbara. She endured it all with grace, sleeping in a chair beside his hospital bed, holding his hand through the worst moments, never complaining publicly about the burden she carried. In November 1980, Steve underwent surgery in Mexico at a clinic that promised alternative treatments. The surgery lasted several hours. He survived the operation but died of a heart attack the following day, November 7, 1980. He was just 50 years old. Steve McQueen's death shocked the world. Fans mourned the loss of an icon. Hollywood eulogized one of its brightest stars. Obituaries focused on his legendary career, his cool persona, his unforgettable performances. They talked about Bullitt and The Great Escape and The Magnificent Seven. They remembered the motorcycle jumps and the car chases and the laconic one-liners. But they didn't talk about the darker aspects of his life. They didn't mention the abuse, the infidelity, the controlling behavior, the way he damaged everyone who loved him. That wasn't the story Hollywood wanted to tell. It wasn't the story fans wanted to hear. So the legend of Steve McQueen, the king of cool, was preserved in amber, perfect and untouchable. But for the women who had been his wives, the story was far more complicated. Neile Adams, his first wife, was devastated by his death despite everything that had happened between them. She later wrote a book about their relationship, trying to make sense of the years they'd spent together. In interviews, she's spoken about Steve with a mixture of love and pain, acknowledging both the good times and the bad. She's described their relationship as an everlasting love, but she's also been honest about the affairs and the heartbreak. For Neile, Steve was the great love of her life and her greatest torment, two truths that somehow coexisted. MacGraw also struggled with Steve's death. Despite the painful end to their marriage, she had never stopped caring about him. In her memoir and interviews, Ollie has been remarkably candid about their relationship. She's talked about Steve's jealousy, his controlling behavior, and her own complicity in giving up her power. She's described feeling like she lost herself during their marriage, becoming someone she didn't recognize. But she's also acknowledged the intensity of what they shared, the genuine passion that had brought them together. Ollie spent years in therapy working through the trauma of her relationship with Steve. She's spoken publicly about recognizing the patterns of abuse, about understanding why she stayed, about forgiving herself for the choices she made. Her honesty has helped many other women recognize similar patterns in their own relationships. And then there's Barbara Minty McQueen, the woman who was with Steve at the end. For decades, Barbara remained largely silent about their relationship. She didn't write tell-all books or give explosive interviews. She remarried, became a photographer, and lived a quiet life out of the spotlight. But in recent years, as she's entered her 80s, Barbara has begun to open up. She's spoken about her time with Steve, about the brief period of happiness they shared before his illness consumed everything. She's described a different side of Steve, a man who was trying to change, who wanted peace and simplicity. But she's also hinted at the difficulties, at the complexity of loving a man carrying so much pain and causing so much harm. Barbara has been particularly vocal about asbestos awareness, dedicating herself to educating people about the dangers of asbestos exposure and advocating for victims of asbestos-related diseases. It's a cause close to her heart because she watched it kill her husband. Through this work, she's honored Steve's memory while also creating her own legacy separate from him. But the question that haunts all three women is the same. Who is Steve McQueen really? Was he the charming, vulnerable man they each fell in love with? Or was he the jealous, abusive, unfaithful man who caused them so much pain? The answer, of course, is that he was both. Human beings are not simple creatures. We contain multitudes, capable of great kindness and terrible cruelty. Sometimes in the same day, sometimes in the same moment. Steve McQueen's childhood trauma was real. The abandonment by his father, the abuse he suffered, the instability of his early years, all of that shaped him profoundly. It created wounds that never fully healed, insecurities that success couldn't soothe. But trauma, while it explains behavior, doesn't excuse it. Millions of people suffer childhood trauma and don't go on to abuse their partners. Steve made choices, again and again, to prioritize his needs over everyone else's, to take what he wanted without regard for the consequences, to hurt people who loved him. Those were choices, not inevitabilities. The story of Steve McQueen and his marriages is a cautionary tale about many things. It's about how society enables abusive men, especially when those men are talented or famous or powerful. It's about how women are conditioned to sacrifice themselves for love, to believe they can save broken men, to endure suffering in silence. It's about the gap between public image and private reality, the way someone can be celebrated as a hero while being a villain at home. It's about the cycle of trauma and how pain gets passed from one generation to the next if we don't break it consciously and deliberately. For decades, the women in Steve McQueen's life stayed mostly quiet about what they endured. That silence was partly about self-protection. Speaking negatively about a dead icon brings criticism and disbelief. It was partly about privacy, a reluctance to air intimate details of their marriages in public. And it was partly about love because despite everything, they all loved him at some point, and love complicates our ability to tell simple stories about people who hurt us. But silence has its costs too. When we don't talk about the darker aspects of famous people's lives, we perpetuate myths. We let young people believe that jealousy is romantic, that controlling behavior is protectiveness, that enduring abuse is loyalty. We allow patterns to continue because we don't name them, don't examine them, don't learn from them. That's why the fact that these women, now in their 80s, are finally speaking more openly about their experiences with Steve McQueen matters. Neile Adams has given interviews where she's been honest about the affairs and the emotional toll they took. She's talked about the double standard, about how Steve demanded fidelity while being serially unfaithful himself. She's acknowledged that she stayed too long, sacrificed too much, enabled behavior she should have walked away from. Ali MacGraw has been even more forthcoming. In her memoir, she detailed the emotional abuse, the controlling behavior, the way she lost herself in the marriage. She's described Steve as both the great love of her life and a source of tremendous pain. She's talked about the years it took to recover, to rebuild her sense of self, to understand what had happened to her. Her candor has been healing not just for her, but for the many women who've read her story and recognized their own experiences in it. Barbara Minty McQueen has been more circumspect, which is understandable given that she was with Steve for such a short time, and much of that time was consumed by his illness. But in recent interviews and through her advocacy work, she's hinted at the complexity of their relationship. She's described a man who was trying to change but still carried all his old demons. She's talked about the difficulty of being young and suddenly thrust into the role of caregiver for a dying man. She's acknowledged that while there was love between them, there was also struggle. What emerges from these women's stories is a portrait of a deeply troubled man whose issues with women stemmed from his abandonment by his mother and the absence of his father. Steve McQueen never learned how to have a healthy relationship. He never saw one modeled for him as a child. He never did the deep therapeutic work necessary to heal his childhood wounds. Instead, he achieved massive success, which gave him the power and resources to indulge his worst impulses without consequence. For most of his life, Steve faced no real accountability for his behavior. Wives could be replaced. Affairs could be hidden or excused. Controlling behavior could be dismissed as the eccentricity of genius. Hollywood and society in general gave men like Steve McQueen a pass, especially when they were making money and entertaining audiences. It's only now, decades after his death, as conversations about toxic masculinity and abusive relationships have become more open and honest, that we can look back at Steve McQueen's life with clearer eyes. We can appreciate his talent as an actor, his charisma as a screen presence, while also acknowledging the harm he caused in his personal life. These two truths can coexist. In fact, they must coexist if we're going to have honest conversations about the complicated legacies of famous people. The revelations from Steve McQueen's widows matter because they complicate the simple narrative. They remind us that behind every iconic image is a real person with flaws and struggles and capacity for harm. They show us that fame and talent don't make someone a good partner or a good person. They demonstrate the importance of listening to women's stories, especially when those stories challenge our cherished myths about powerful men. For anyone who has experienced a relationship with a controlling, jealous, or abusive partner, the stories of Neile, Ali, and Barbara will ring painfully familiar. The cycle of abuse they describe, the initial charm followed by increasing control, the jealousy masquerading as love, the erosion of self-worth, the difficulty of leaving, these are universal experiences. They transcend era and circumstance. What happened in Steve McQueen's marriages in the 1960s and 70s is still happening in relationships today. That's why these stories are so important. They serve as warnings and as roadmaps for escape. They show that even strong, successful, beautiful women can find themselves trapped in abusive relationships, which means anyone can. They demonstrate that leaving is possible, that recovery is possible, that life after an abusive relationship is possible. Neile Adams went on to have a successful second marriage to Alvin Toffel, which lasted until his death in 2005. She reconnected with her career later in life, and has spent her later years sharing her story in ways that might help others. Ali MacGraw never remarried after Steve McQueen. She's spoken about learning to be happy alone, to find fulfillment in herself rather than in relationships with men. She's built a successful career as a yoga instructor and wellness advocate, helping others find peace and health. Barbara Minty McQueen remarried and has built a life focused on photography and advocacy. She's used her experience to help others, particularly through her work raising awareness about asbestos and mesothelioma. All three women survived Steve McQueen. That might seem like a strange way to put it, but it's accurate. They survived his jealousy, his infidelities, his controlling behavior, his emotional abuse. They survived the loss of their own identities and careers in service of his ego. They survived the public scrutiny, the tabloid coverage, the judgment from people who didn't understand what was happening behind closed doors. And they've used their survival to create meaningful lives, to help others, to tell truths that needed telling. The story of Steve McQueen's marriages is ultimately a story about power and its abuse. Steve had power as a man in a patriarchal society. He had power as a famous person in a culture that worships celebrity. He had power as a wealthy person in a system that equates money with worth. And he used that power to control and harm the women who loved him. But those women, in their 80s now, are reclaiming their own power by telling their stories, by refusing to let the legend of the King of Cool erase the reality of what they endured. Their voices matter. Their truths matter. And the lessons we can learn from their experiences matter. As we look back at Hollywood's golden age, we need to be willing to examine these stories with honesty and compassion. We can acknowledge that Steve McQueen was a talented actor who created memorable performances, while also acknowledging that he was a troubled man who hurt people. We can feel sympathy for the childhood trauma that shaped him while also holding him accountable for his adult choices. We can appreciate the complexity of human nature without excusing harmful behavior. The revelations from Steve McQueen's widows don't diminish his cinematic legacy. Bullitt is still a great film. The Great Escape is still thrilling. His performances are still compelling. But they do complicate the simple story of the cool, rebellious hero. They remind us that the people we see on screen are not the same as the people they are at home. They challenge us to think more critically about who we celebrate and why. For the millions of fans who idolized Steve McQueen, these revelations might be uncomfortable. It's hard to learn that someone you admired was capable of such cruelty. But discomfort is part of growth. We grow by confronting difficult truths, by expanding our understanding, by being willing to hold complexity. The real Steve McQueen, the one who existed beyond the movie posters and magazine covers, was a man capable of both charm and cruelty, vulnerability and violence, love and destruction. He was shaped by trauma he never healed, driven by demons he never conquered, seeking fulfillment in all the wrong places and in all the wrong ways. The women who loved him paid the price for his inability to heal himself. They gave him their youth, their careers, their sense of self. They endured behaviors that no one should have to endure. They stayed longer than they should have because of love, because of children, because of vows, because of hope, because leaving is always harder than people who haven't been there understand. But they all eventually found their way out. They all eventually found themselves again. They all eventually built lives that weren't defined by Steve McQueen's shadow. And now, in their 80s, they're ensuring that their stories are told, not with bitterness but with honesty, not with vengeance but with truth. At 85, the awful truth these women are revealing isn't really about Steve McQueen at all. It's about all the Steve McQueens, all the charming, troubled, powerful men who use their partners as emotional dumping grounds. It's about the patterns that repeat across generations until someone breaks them. It's about the myths we tell ourselves about love and what it should look like. Real love doesn't demand you give up your identity. Real love doesn't require you to endure jealousy and control. Real love doesn't justify infidelity or abuse. These are the lessons that Neile, Ollie, and Barbara learned the hard way, and they're sharing them now so others don't have to learn them the same way. The story of Steve McQueen's marriages is a tragedy, but it's not without redemption. The redemption comes from the survival and thriving of his ex-wives, from their willingness to speak truth to power even decades later, from the healing they've found and the wisdom they've gained. Steve McQueen died at 50, never really growing beyond the wounded child he'd always been. But the women he married lived on, did the work he never did, healed the wounds he inflicted, and emerged as whole people with powerful stories to tell. In the end, they got the last word. And that word is the truth, the awful, complicated, necessary truth about what it was really like to be married to the King of Cool. It's a truth that shatters the legend but illuminates reality. It's a truth that honors their experiences and validates their pain. It's a truth that might help someone watching this video recognize warning signs in their own relationship and find the courage to leave. It's a truth that reminds us all that behind every iconic image is a human story far more complex than any movie plot. And it's a truth that at 85, these remarkable women have finally found the strength and platform to share with the world.